how does the thought of helplessness frighten me?
The best daily test for me is, am I grateful?
That I finally came to the realization that I simply could not do it.
It's only proven in the experience that in that defeat, victory begins.
This program is the first in a series of 12 candid conversations between George Mann and Dick Rice. They have walked the 12 steps of AA to experience greater wholeness and invite you to walk and reflect with them as they share personal stories, insights from Scripture, and some of their individual spiritual growth experiences. Dr. George Mann is Medical Director of St. Mary's Chemical Dependency Services in Minneapolis. Father Dick Rice is the Director of Loyola Spiritual Direction Center in St. Paul, Minnesota.
The first step says, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable.
George, I would like to complement that with a couple of places in the New Testament where Paul, in his second letter to the Corinthians, is speaking, I think, of the same reality that you've just spoken of, George, in the first step. Paul will say this in the 12th chapter, 3 times I begged the Lord that this might leave me, this thorn in the flesh. The Lord said to me, my grace is enough for you. For in weakness, power reaches perfection. And so I willingly boast of my weaknesses instead, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. This is the same Paul who a little bit earlier in this same letter said this, this treasure we possess in earthen vessels, to make it clear that its surpassing power comes from God and not from us. That's the 4th chapter of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. When I look back at my own growing up spiritually, trying to respond to the Spirit of God as it was given to me, it almost sounds like a contradiction to speak of powerlessness, that so much of my own struggle to grow up spiritually and to respond to the Spirit of God has been to appreciate what the Spirit has given me, the gifts that are mine, and then the ability to put those gifts into the service of other people. And so it was to come to a sense of my own power seemed to be the first task of my adult life anyway.
I think you just touched on the other part of the step that is important, and that goes with the whole sense of that developing power, or the sense of developing power is the need to manage. That need to manage, that need to control is the fodder that we feed on to become more and more powerful. And of course, the other side to that whole thing is the basic recognition that we are creatures, that we don't have the power, that course that we want to chart for ourselves, where we say, well, I can manage my life, I can manage my career, I can manage all these factors in my life. The more we believe that and become invested in that, the more we walk away from the fact that we are creatures of God, that God does run the world, that God does run our lives, that we are not in charge.
I'm amazed at how hard that is to bring home, to myself anyway. It's the beginning of the book of Genesis. It's the whole basis of our tradition. Another has made us, and we are continually dependent on another. It's the beginning of most catechisms. I grew up getting a gold star for who made us. God made us. Why did God make us? And yet, I thought I learned those lessons well as a first and second grader. And find out 40 years later, I am only just beginning to learn what was involved in that.
And coming to the whole roots of it, the whole Adam and Eve story of the Garden of Eden is that I am powerful within myself, and I don't need anything outside of myself. And so I think what we do is we sort of give some sort of a nod to God and say, well, there's a God there, but that God is out there someplace because I'm the person who's really in charge, and I'm running things. And Lord help you if you don't let me run things the way I want to run things. What we're really talking about here is we're talking about the whole delusion of becoming invested entirely in ourselves, and that becomes a very anxiety-producing mechanism. The first step, of course, identifies alcohol, and it says our lives become unmanageable when we deal with alcohol. We try so hard to manage, and then as we get into that management, it's almost like the paradox of the more I try to manage, the less able I am to manage. The more things I try to gain control of. I reflect back on my own life, and the only example I can give is that at one point in trying to manage my family, my job, the people around me, I really felt like I was trying to drive 40 teams of horses at the same time, and all 40 teams were trying to go off in all directions, and the enormous amount of energy that it took to try to maintain that. And at the same time, there was also that inner awareness that you couldn't do it, that you were losing it. And so the more you worked to control it, the more I was aware that I was losing it.
Well, what in that, George, brought you to the first step? Was it that those teams of horses all finally did get chaotic and out there in all directions? What brought you to your senses? How did you land on the step?
I think what happened was that that I reached a point that I finally came to the realization that I simply could not do it. I could not do it. Once you begin to examine of what I cannot do, then of course you become increasingly aware of how limited that is, of how limited you are in the things that you really can manage. And as you look at those more and more closely, they simply disappear almost before your eyes. And so as you're in that process, you are thrown more and more onto God with the recognition that it is God who runs the world. It is God who runs our lives, that we are powerless, that our lives are unmanageable.
But it is so paradoxical, literally. I mean, it's only proven in the experience that in that defeat, victory begins. Because it sounds like it's just the opposite of everything we've been born for. You sound like you completely lost.
The step uses the word alcohol. And it mentions alcohol as the idol that we worship, the idol that we put our faith into. If you talk to anyone who has struggled with alcoholism, that was the answer. That was the answer to everything. I think it's important, though, to recognize that alcohol is only one of the idols. You know, we have the idols of money and possessions and sex and unhealthy relationships, and the list goes on and on and on.
Emotions, food, it goes on. And yes. I think there are 120 different self-help groups now that use the 12 steps in one way or another.
And I think we have to recognize that alcohol in this step, as it's written, is only one example of one of the things that one of the outs, one of the escape hatches that we can use, rather than the need to face ourselves, to face God, to face the issues of our lives head-on and realistically.
Part of my own codependency, I realized the extent to which I was a workaholic. and how work had dominated my life, and how I thought I was dependent on work for a sense of my well-being, a feeling of my well-being, to act as though I was well, and was just amazed at the realization of how powerlessness I am over my work, and how I have to keep turning that over, and how much I need the help of the team of people with whom I work, so that I can get into a rhythm of play and work that is at all normal and at all human and realistic.
I think it's also important to recognize that when we deal with issues of powerlessness, unmanageability, the need to control, those kinds of issues, we are talking about some of the most basic drives that exist. There are people talk about what it means to be a person, what it means to be human. What are the issues involved? What are some of the basic issues involved in humanity? And as we distill those kind of things down, it's the things like the need to win, the need to be right, the need to have power over you, the need to control. All of those things come to the surface when we look at the very basic issues of humanity, which is why, of course, these issues are the first step. Because without addressing those first basic things about us, how invested am I in control? How invested am I in power? How does the thought of helplessness frighten me? How about unmanageability? I think for a lot of people in our society, words like helplessness and unmanageability are terribly frightening words. To come to the admission that I am helpless, my life is unmanageable.
Well, when I stay with that word frightening, then, how frightening those words are, and try to keep peeling back the onion of my own motivation, I ask myself, well, what am I so frightened about that I have to control and manipulate to keep my world moving and keep myself moving in it? And I can say, well, I'm afraid of the loss of a lot, but finally what I'm afraid of, when I think of my deepest, darkest fears, it's a fear of abandonment. It's a fear that I will be abandoned by God finally, and left in some outer, cold, isolated darkness. That's always my worst nightmare.
Is that death?
That's death, an isolating, abandoned death. Sometimes death seems kind of nice in comparison to that way of dying and being left forever. So we're touching primal anxieties, really.
Right. One of the issues is that there's this also basic primal fear of being out of control. And so we're walking a fine line of definition when we talk about the difference between being out of control and giving up control, of the hanging on to control as an essential element of my being, and being out of control. Out of control is really not what we're talking about.
Right.
Out of control being a very pathologic state that we as human beings can get into.
So we're really talking what Paul speaks of as one of the fruits of the Spirit as self-control, finally. I'm amazed at my own inclination and the inclination of so many people I work with to try to be in control of all of reality out here while not doing anything about the self-control that they might be capable of if they gave themselves over to the Spirit of God and worked with their own lives. People are trying to control everyone and everything. Meanwhile, they're weighing 20 pounds more than they ought to. Their work habits are crazy. They're smoking too much, maybe drinking too much. Some of their relationships with their kids are way out of order, and yet to suggest that maybe they start working with those, oh, they don't want any part of that. As long as they could help it. They love, though, to be manipulating the lives of their children or their employees, but don't want to deal with any kind of call to self-control.
What is the basic element of spiritual health? And I think that, at least for me, the basic element of spiritual health is the recognition and the living in harmony with reality. To use the example that you just gave, is that if I consider myself to be a spiritually healthy person, and I'm drinking too much, working too much, eating too much, smoking too much, all of those kinds of things, and at the same time I believe I can be spiritually healthy, I don't think that's possible. Those are contradictory terms. You talked about recognition of your inner reality. The basic sense of living in reality is the external environment being in harmony with your internal environment. When those two mesh comfortably, when I'm in touch with that outside world, and I know what the outside world is, I can live in it comfortably, not in conflict. And my inside world, my inner environment, fits with that comfortably. Then I've at least got the basic elements of growth, of spiritual fulfillment, of mental health, all of those things.
I think I agree, but let me test what you're saying against a Jewish notion that has come to mean so much to me. When our Jewish brothers and sisters speak of shalom, their word for hello and goodbye, peace be with you, it seems to me that they're speaking of a very active, dynamic harmonization of myself with the whole universe. Right. We tend to think of peace as kind of a laid-back, almost a lull between war.
We think of peace as lack of or absence of conflict.
Yes, yes. As though conflict is the positive. And that's not only the way the world so often is and relationships are, but almost the way they ought to be. I've been amazed in reading back in the last discourse how dear that sense of harmony is to Jesus. When he speaks in John's Gospel, some of the very last things that he says before he dies, he says, "Peace is my farewell to you. My peace is my gift to you. I do not give it to you as the world gives peace." He knows that what the world defines as peace is lack of conflict, as you say. But for him, peace is that shalom, that being in harmony with. When I look back at the last year and I think of different groups that are really in harmony, who embodies peace as I see it in the world? It's a group like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, or it's Torval and Dean, were a marvelous example for me of woman and man being at peace with each other.
In harmony.
But the work that took by each of them to be in harmony. As he moves on, Jesus says in the 16th chapter of John, "I tell you all this, that in me you may find peace. In me you will suffer in the world, but take courage, I have overcome the world." Now, it's especially intriguing when, as he rises and appears risen in John's Gospel, the very first things he says to us disciples is, standing before us with our doors locked for fear of the Jews, "Peace be with you. Peace be with you," he said again. Then he breathes on us and says, "Receive the Spirit. If you forgive one another's sins, they are forgiven." He seems to realize that we're going to step all over each other, and that the way to peace is continual forgiveness of one another and of ourselves.
And I think out of all of that comes another big piece of what's involved in the first step, and that is that following the realization of powerlessness, unmanageability, helplessness, harmony, internal and external harmony, what's the payoff? what arises from that? And what arises from that is obviously gratitude.
It's gratitude, it's the serenity prayer, it's again the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. But you're right, when I ask myself, when I give myself a daily test, am I normal, am I healthy, am I on the first step and on the way with my own life? The best daily test for me is, am I grateful?
And what that gratitude for me consists of is that to know that I am in harmony with you, with the world, with nature, with my family, with God, with all of those factors in my life. Where disharmony exists in any one of those areas, I think disharmony and gratitude are mutually exclusive. There's the sense of walking through nature, recognizing the harmony that you have with it, and out of that, the act of gratitude for me being me, for you being you, for the people in our lives being who they are and what they are, in our relationship to them, with the comfort that comes of the need to not have to manage, to not have to control, to not have to have the power over any of that, and to simply live in harmony with it.
Then the only element I would add, you've implied it at least, would be that harmony with myself. I now start and end my day with just 10 minutes of prayer, giving thanks for my own self as given, starting from my toes, working all the way up to my brain, my memory, my imagination. When I'm doing that every day and see I too have been God-given, then the gratitude is there from beginning to end, and I find more often than not I'm landing on the first step. Always just learning it, always. I've been working it 7.5 years, I guess, hard, and finding I can slip off it very easily. But more often than not, I'm on it when my gratitude, very concrete, very specific, for all of those relationships that you mentioned, is in place. More and more, I like what had sounded like a bromide when I first heard it, a slogan, but like so many of the slogans, they're so wise, but it takes me time to grow into them. Gratitude is the attitude of beatitude. I like that.
And the beatitude is basically gratitude. I mean, all of the statements of all of the beatitudes are just enumerate all of those things in the world that we can be grateful for. I think that as we use language, people use the language and say, well, we are taking the first step. We are in the first step. I think the issue of the first step, and you referred to it, is that it isn't something you take. It isn't something that you look at. It's an attitude. It's a way of life. It's something that becomes so integral to you that without it, you simply cannot move on to where you want to go. It is something like oxygen to our being. Without a ready, steady intake of oxygen, with every breath we take, we very quickly die if our source of oxygen is cut off. That, as I think, is the analogy I would put to the first step, that spiritual life is based on living in the environment of the first step.
Yes.
When we don't live in that environment, we simply do not live very long.
Yes.
Spiritually.
I find that too. I think we're living in it, we're breathing it. I'm eager to take the next steps with you. Thank you.
Thank
You've been
you.
good company. Thank you.